Please, Father. I only had the Fire Nation's best interest at heart. I'm sorry I spoke out of turn.
Come on! Strike me! You've never held back before!
It's time for you to look inward and begin asking yourself the big questions. Who are you? And what do you want?
That's who you are, Zuko. Someone who keeps fighting even though it's hard.
My father, who challenged me, a 13-year-old boy, to an Agni Kai. How can you possibly justify a duel with a child?
I'm angry at myself!
We're going to be talking about some pretty heavy stuff today. Child abuse, domestic violence, sexual violence, trauma, self-harm, suicide, and genocide. If you can't engage with these topics safely, then I recommend clicking the video in the top right, where I talk about some really beautiful stories by Neil Gaiman with my little puppy, Willow. Sources will all be cited in the corner of the screen and in the description. I want to say a big thank you to everyone over at my Patreon, simply because crowdfunding means that I don't have to worry about topics like these being demonetized as much because, well, they are on YouTube. If you want to support this kind of content, then it's greatly appreciated, and the links are all down below.
I thought it was my honor that I wanted, but really, I was just trying to please you.
Zuko's story is one of rising above abuse, of picking up the pieces of yourself and figuring out who you are meant to be in the wake of it, of reconstructing your understanding of the world and seeing the lies you were raised with. But to truly understand his journey, we need to look closely at what Zuko means and feels psychologically when he talks about honor. Zuko repeatedly justifies and contextualizes everything he does as a way of regaining his honor in the eyes of the Fire Nation, and more importantly, his father. He burns the Kyoshi village down, he throws himself into the icy wilderness with the Avatar on his back with nowhere to go, risking almost inevitable death, rather than let go of what, in his mind, is his one chance, his one way back to redemption. He betrays Iroh, the one man who has always been there for him across the years. He betrays Katara's trust, all for a chance at regaining his honor. Emotionally, it causes him to flash to anger at a moment's notice. Honor is such a deeply rooted idea in Zuko's mind. Except, psychologically, it's not actually about honor, is it? Honor is a cultural, sociological idea, something that has been used to hide Ozai's manipulation and abuse, to justify it psychologically to Zuko, obscuring it when the true force behind Zuko's actions is shame. Shame is so deeply rooted in Zuko's mind that he doesn't even recognize that this is what he feels, that this is what it is.
But I don't feel any shame at all. I'm as proud as ever.
Prince Zuko, pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source. True humility is the only antidote to shame.
Shame can be broadly understood as individuals' intense disappointment concerning their own shortcomings, which they perceive as discrepant from standards of significance to them or important others. It's difficult to understate just how important the moment his father challenged him to an Agni Kai and burned his face was for transforming how Zuko felt about himself and the world.
Please, Father. I only had the Fire Nation's best interest at heart. I'm sorry I spoke out of turn.
You will fight for your honor.
I won't fight you.
Zuko comes into this moment thinking he should only be ashamed for speaking out of turn in defense of those lowly Fire Nation soldiers. But to Ozai, the greatest sin is to refuse to put your enemies in their place, to violently assert yourself, to quibble over right or wrong, to put family or friends first. It's all showing weakness rather than power or strength. That reluctance to be decisive by violently asserting himself is where he dishonored himself in the eyes of his father. And it's why this moment radically changes his view of himself and the world in the aftermath.
After the duel, The Fire Lord said that by refusing to fight, Zuko had shown shameful weakness. As punishment, he was banished and sent to capture the Avatar. Only then could he return with his honor.
Those standards Ozai laid down in that moment suddenly take on a new importance for Zuko psychologically as a way he should measure himself, why he should feel ashamed. Expressions of violence, anger, and power become a way towards pride and self-esteem, of bringing himself closer to his father's standards, synonymous with being strong and undoing that shame. In a way, Zuko is creating what is sometimes called a false self, that makes a show of being real, feeling fulfilled as a way of meeting someone else's expectations of them, because they don't view themselves as an individual with legitimate needs or wants or thoughts. Not really. Right from the first episode, Zuko is heavily relying on that fury and frustration as a source of his firebending, no matter how much Iroh insists otherwise. When he betrays Iroh, fully capitulating to Ozai's way of thinking, you can see the raw ferocity in Zuko's face as he firebends, unlike any other moment in the series. Shame focuses on the self as characterologically flawed. Victims who attribute abusive maltreatment to deficits or flaws in their character may then experience even greater helplessness and hopelessness, thereby exacerbating failures to report abuse or seek help. What this means is that victims of abuse involving intense shaming will sometimes attribute that shame to inherent parts of who they are, their character, their bodies, that though they cannot change or control, it inherently justifies the abuse in their mind. And after being burned across the face and banished, left scarred and without a home for putting family and relationships when he refused to fight over power, Zuko is taught to see that kinder part of himself as weakness, intensifying that sense of hopelessness in himself and making him less reluctant to seek help in Iroh or blame Ozai, because he has been taught to blame that side of himself. Dishonorable not because he has done something shameful, but because he is shameful. And Ozai telling Zuko he is weak and shameful by nature goes back a long time before his banishment. Ozai nearly tossed Zuko over the palace walls to die when he was just an infant, because he was disgusted that Zuko might not be a firebender. As a child, Zuko's attempts to rescue animals, to figure out what was right and wrong, crying when hurt, earned him nothing but scorn. Even simply by being a weaker firebender than Azula, Ozai insisted that Azula was born lucky, but Zuko was lucky to be born. All of this creates a growing undercurrent of characterological blame for his abuse. His mother Ursa did work to assure Zuko otherwise, to tell him he was worth so much. But after she disappeared, Ozai's view of him and the world was the only thing being emotionally reinforced, eventually culminating in his banishment, which psychologically confirmed everything he had been told. But shame also warps how children manage their abuse. Victims may conceal the abuse to avoid stigmatizing the self or family as morally corrupt, to shield others from feeling meta-shame regarding the victim's disclosure, to minimize further attacks from family members for revealing the abuse, or because the victims felt inability to manage shame. This doesn't necessarily mean that victims of abuse will recognize the abuse is wrong when they're hiding it, but that sometimes managing that shame will mean they reframe these traumatic events so that there's no need to reveal them, to think of them as abuse, that they are normal, temporary, or justified. Children who are physically harmed by their caregivers frequently attribute the mistreatment to them being bad, that they could have avoided the beating if only they had behaved appropriately. This may provide the child with a sense of control over the abuse and serve as a protective factor. Commonly, they will tell themselves they tempted their abusers, that all families fight, but it's over now, that the abuser has assured them it won't happen again, or that the child could have simply avoided it and they might in the future. Except, as with most abuse, these things are cyclical. They go into periods of calm and then ramp up in tension and happen again. And these thoughts are coping mechanisms when they're trapped in that unhealthy cycle, as a lot of children are. Zuko experiences many of these same thought patterns. He blames himself characterologically and doesn't speak about it to others because the alternative is that his own father does not love him, that he's a cruel, capricious, abusive man, and all those moments that he has felt loved by him were wrong, that they were fictions. So instead, he must have forced his father to act the way he did. He could have avoided it if he wasn't being bad, or in this case, dishonorable. A cultural and sociological idea that exists almost objectively in a sense, outside their relationship, so that Ozai cannot be blamed for treating him this way. For a time, he even prefers to blame Azula for his childhood. However damaging and unhealthy this is, this way of thinking gives Zuko a sense of control, a way back, hope in a twisted way that he could have managed this situation and can in the future. But it's also not as simple as that, is it? Because though Zuko does kind of blame himself characterologically for being weak, part of him doesn't want to, it resists that. Focuses on the self as flawed can prompt escape behaviors, and they will sometimes respond angrily. This is often termed humiliated fury or shame rage. Shame rage need not, but may in certain individuals, reflect self-protective mechanisms meant to avoid attributing shortcomings to stable self-characteristics. Zuko was always prone to frustration. We see that. We see Azula riling him up as a kid, pushing him into the fountain, shaming Iroh for giving up after his son's death, all of which Zuko has to control his anger with. But it's pretty clear to me that that anger evolved into something else, something darker and more violent in the wake of his banishment. The week after being banished, Zuko arrives in the Western Air Temple. Iroh insists that he take time to heal. His burns have barely begun to heal, but Zuko immediately flashes to anger.
What else would I expect to hear from the laziest man in the Fire Nation?
This isn't just angry, this is cruel. And we can contrast this moment with when Zuko learns that Iroh lost his son, Lu Ten.
It means Uncle's a quitter and a loser.
What are you talking about? Uncle's not a quitter.
Oh, yes he is. He found out his son died and he just fell apart. A real general would stay and burn Ba Sing Se to the ground, not lose the battle and come home crying.
How do you know what he should do? He's probably just sad his only kid is gone.
Where before Zuko empathized with Iroh, who was hurting, and he saw the importance of having time to heal, to step away and reflect, he will not give himself that same love anymore. Something happened to that part of him. It's almost an uncontrolled, violent rejection of those parts of himself. He equates taking time to heal and reflect with weakness, with laziness, sounding exactly like Azula did all those years ago. Afraid of attributing his shame and dishonor to those stable self-characteristics, Zuko overcompensates emotionally and rejects anything, any emotion, any thought that could be viewed as close to that. Anger and aggression became a way of appearing decisive like his father wanted, taking action for action's sake, not quibbling over right or wrong. It's that humiliated fury, that shame rage that we just read about. A reactive self-protective mechanism, because he wants to view those things not as an inherent part of who he is, but as something that can be purged and destroyed. Because if he can't, then he's never coming home. He will never see his family again. He will never feel his father's love. And he can't bear that. At its core, this is Zuko's struggle. Is he inherently weak, or can he get rid of those parts of himself by becoming more violent, more cruel, more like his father? And are those parts of him worth anything at all? When set against the world that Ozai has created for him, one absent of love and empathy, it's hard to see where he fits. And it takes seeing those parts of him as valuable again to begin rebuilding his self-worth. Zuko grew up in, if not a broken household, then a household of broken people. Ozai abused his wife from the first day he met her. After this day, do not mention Hera, your family, or your old life ever again. You belong to the royal family now, and to me. It's a textbook tactic of abusers to isolate their partners from friends or family, any people who could question the way their relationship works, and to more easily control them. While in some relationships the abuser may insist that anyone trying to help the victim is just trying to undermine their relationship or control them, Ozai is just being sadistic here. He's acting on an ingrained sense of entitlement and ownership over her. But there is a subtext here that I think is really important to address. There's a lot of implication that Ozai abused Eartha, either physically, sexually, or both. When she returns to the Fire Nation Palace, Zuko offers that she can sleep in her old room, the very one where she would have once slept with Ozai. But she insists that one of the guest rooms will be just fine. As she wanders about the palace, she is plagued by feelings of guilt, of being unsafe, of simply walking in the halls where he once stood. And when she comes before a grand, imposing picture of him, she suffers something of a breakdown. Symptomatically, these are all common reactions for abuse victims returning to the places of their traumatic experiences. While we are never told explicitly what happened with Ursa and Ozai, it's a pretty reasonable conclusion to draw. Literal physical space can feel threatening to victims of especially spousal abuse and especially sexual violence, where patterns of expected behavior from the past create conditioned responses like this, often ones that manifest in submissive or passive behaviors where asserting oneself becomes difficult, even in situations where they know that they are perfectly safe. Trauma creates irrational feelings and responses in us, and that's okay. But it's why we have to work through them, and Ursa does with Iroh's help. Even facing Ozai again behind bars without his powers, with Iroh right behind her, Ursa feels that same fear as he swears that she will beg for death before him. And yet, she manages to overcome that trauma response and control those flashbacks, those paralyzing symptoms, which is a real cornerstone of trauma recovery. This dynamic between Ozai and Ursa is important to understanding the social environment in which Zuko and Azula were raised. It was already isolating, being a product of the royal class, but its toxicity is only compounded by the unhealthy parental dynamic controlling what should have been the primary stable elements of their lives. One paper found that children who were exposed to parental violence were significantly correlated with depression, PTSD, and in particular, aggression. Something that we see in Azula as a controlled, methodical violence and as frustration turned rage in Zuko. We don't know if Zuko or Azula ever personally witnessed direct violence against Ursa at Ozai's hand, either physical or sexual. Zuko's lack of awareness of her feelings towards the palace upon her return suggests maybe not. But this is also something that can be normalized in the eyes of children, and Ursa may have gone to great lengths to conceal it from them. She often put herself, even physically, between Ozai and the children, most famously in agreeing to leave in exchange for saving Zuko's life. It is, after all, subtext. Whatever the case, Zuko either witnessed the abuse personally, or he witnessed the fallout, the tension, the underlying control, verbal and emotional, that Ozai exerted over his mother, that cycle of abuse, going round and round. Violence, just a more subtle kind of violence. Surveillance, where one feels that they, even privately, are being watched, are not safe, can be invaded at any time, a panopticon of fear that controls you even when you are alone. If you've ever lived in a house like this, you'll know what that fear is like. While Ursa may have done her best to create a safe environment for her children, Ozai was unequivocally a neglectful parent, as well as the one that controlled every element of their lives. what they learned in school, who they could speak with, how hard they trained, when, how, and which needs were met. Abusive dynamics thrive in families where one partner controls the finances and most of the decisions regarding the children, especially in social communities where they occupy a traditionally protected role of authority, such as because they are the ordained head of the house. And it's only more dangerous in cultural environments where the authority should not be questioned. These sociological and economic structures are inclined to justify and protect abusers, and it's precisely the situation that Ursa finds herself in with Ozai, the unquestionable Fire Lord who controls which friends they're allowed to see, when they're allowed to go out, how they learn, and what they learn. Abused spouses like this, caught up in these dynamics, will often be trying their best, but it's like swimming and trying to keep everyone around you afloat. You can only do it for so long, and eventually, you're going to drown. Regardless of Ursa's efforts, Ozai created an environment that neglected Zuko and Azula's emotional and psychological needs, twisted their understanding of what love and strength was, and taught Zuko and Azula to value their father's approval above all else. One paper looking at child neglect identified 3 factors with the greatest psychological impact: family conflict and maternal support and paternal affection measured predicted children's internalizing, externalizing, and social behavior as they grew up. These 3 factors in children developing healthy psychological bonds explain a lot of Zuko's early childhood, being exposed to repeated family conflict and a lack of any fatherly affection. What he did have was maternal support, but that too was undermined by the neglectful environment that Ozai created, and eventually, Ursa was gone too. Children given limited emotional support inadequately deal with challenging interpersonal situations, and they struggle to manage their emotions, helping explain Zuko's own difficulties with emotional regulation, particularly anger, but other emotions across the series too. The darkest way this manifests in Zuko is in the blue spirit, a persona he adopts numerous times across the series. He uses it to seek vengeance on someone who humiliated Iroh. He robs and beats people up, steals their food, and he uses it to almost take Appa. It's a multi-dimensional symbol, but it seems to align with Zuko's darker, desperate, almost obsessive nature. The mask lets him become a hollow version of himself without accountability, whatever way his feelings take him, surrendering to his lowest instincts, as Iroh says. It is, in a sense, what Ozai wants of him. A machine, and it's why him turning away from that idea of himself at first is marked by him throwing down the mask. Co-parenting is the degree of unity between parents in the way that they teach and nurture a child, and it goes without saying that Ozai and Ursa employed entirely different parenting strategies. Ozai tells Zuko that he is sickened by the sight of him, because Zuko always wrestled over what is right and wrong, even as a child, instead of deciding what was right and wrong, asserting himself as an expression of will and power. Ozai views indecisiveness like this as deferential, as weakness, and was punished. Ursa, on the other hand, encourages moral exploration. In Zuko alone, we see her admonish Zuko for hurting little turtle ducks, and she repeatedly reinforces that good-natured side to him, the kind that wants the best for others and wants to figure out what that is. Ozai reinforced strength and power, a kind of self-righteousness, while Ursa reinforced empathy. Neglectful households with an abusive parent will often have low degrees of co-parenting, with a cycle of shame and reinforcement that makes it difficult for children to express themselves authentically, figure out who they are meant to be, because life never really settles into a coherent moral world. Children exposed to abuse go through many such anger to shame cycles in which children are implicitly backing down and apologizing for their inappropriate behaviors to appease the parents, a darned if they do and darned if they don't emotional dilemma. They need to manage understandable feelings of anger in response to normal frustration, like task failure, and also manage these via submissive or appeasement displays to prevent parental counterattack. Fundamentally, for a child, this is a really difficult emotional landscape to navigate. to know what to do to appease your parents, to be treated as a good child, and gain self-esteem and social approval in that world as you develop your understanding of yourself. Self-concept is about creating our own sense of identity, who we are, who we want to be, especially between the ages of 7 and 18, and it's closely tied to self-esteem and the positive things that we believe about ourselves. So, where Azula developed a self-concept around her father's parenting as a fire-bending prodigy consistently rewarded for her displays of power and ferocity and decisiveness, Zuko gravitated towards his mother, who validated that indecisiveness as moral exploration, who assured him he is valuable and loved in spite of his lack of ability.
I failed.
No, I loved watching you. That's who you are, Zuko. Someone who keeps fighting even though it's hard.
And when we think about Ozai's standards here, that's only comparatively. Compared to Azula, Zuko is a talented firebender. At 16, he bested a Fire Nation admiral. It's almost like, in one sense, Ozai just wants to pit his children against each other. That it wouldn't matter how good Zuko was, just that he is worse than Azula. Because that self-concept is complicated for Zuko. He is told both, you are someone who never gives up, and you are a failure. Those feelings are contradictory, but it's what children with low co-parenting are often stuck with psychologically, and they've got to manage that somehow. Especially after his mother leaves, Zuko is never given a healthy way to deal with his frustrations with the world, and doing so is taken as disrespectful defiance, repeating that anger to shame cycle, and pushing him to develop a more damaging self-concept. Identity versus role confusion is a crucial part of the teenage years. Adolescents experience an identity crisis, which is described as an attempt to define who you are, where you are heading, and how you fit into society. It is the first real opportunity to develop continuity with the past, meaning in the present, and direction for the future, and is the basis for self-acceptance and self-esteem. But Ozai never gives Zuko the opportunity to develop that continuity, that identity, a fully coherent self-concept, and he's stuck with that identity crisis. Because this is the truth. That shame was coded into the way that Zuko was parented long before he was ever banished. Instead of being told that he failed at something, Ozai tells him over and over, you are a failure. And that creates a distinctly different relationship with failure in someone's mind. When we talk about trauma and abuse, when we're trying to help someone who has been through something like this, it's easy to narrow in on individual instances, the darkest and most dramatic moments. But sometimes it's the small, repeated, monotonous moments, often over years, that have the longest lasting psychological impact on themselves and how they view the world. These persistent feelings of shame were intended to make Zuko feel like an outcast, a common theme in abusive households. In some cases of physical and/or sexual abuse, disclosures lead to the most feared outcome of all, being removed from one's home and family. Once again, this may reinforce the perpetrator's admonitions and reinforce the child's developing self-view as a figurative and now literal outcast. Children are left imagining their parents' rage and feeling responsible for the disruption of their entire family. This is discussing children being reluctant to talk for fear of being removed by government agencies, placed in foster homes and the like. But there is an underlying theme here that remains true. Abusers will blame their victims for causing arguments and rifts within the family, and the shame they inflict manifests in them feeling like an outcast, meaning recognizing or disclosing the abuse would confirm those feelings, that they aren't part of the family, that they are responsible for tearing it apart. In some cases, abusers will exploit this outcast feeling to gain control over their victims, painting themselves as their only source of support and affection and inclusion, particularly in the case of sexual abuse, while others may withhold their approval to maintain control over them, which is what we see with Ozai. I think this feeling most clearly comes out in Zuko when Azula tells him that his father wants him to come home.
Father's changed his mind. Family is suddenly very important to him. Family are the only ones you can really trust. Father regrets your banishment. He wants you home.
There was always an inner circle in which Azula was welcome and Zuko has only ever been able to grasp at the fringes. If your parents have ever played favorites or put your siblings' needs or tantrums above your own, treated you as selfish for wanting the same sort of attention, then you'll know what that's like. That sense of being an outcast was always there for him, only reinforced after Ursa left and made concrete by his banishment. It's such an intense feeling that, like a lot of children, Zuko doesn't want to call out his abuse, to see that he is being manipulated here, and he turns to anger when Iroh suggests that this is at all not authentic.
You don't know how my father feels about me. You don't know anything.
Because Zuko, at least subconsciously, knows that if this isn't real, it only confirms that fear, that he is an outcast, that he has splintered the family forever, that he will never return. As a kid, Zuko seems to have imagined his family as kind of happy, or at least functional. He says that there were times when they were truly happy, and he used to believe that his father would never hurt him. Not really. How truly happy they were, and how much of it was the hopeful wishes of a child making sense they could of the world, we don't know. But it does mean that Zuko felt keeping his family together was precious to him, and he feared being responsible for destroying it. At one point, we see that Zuko suffers from nightmares where his mother cries out to him for help and he does nothing. It's mocking the night she left. She tells him that everything she has done is for him. It's intended to assure him that he hasn't done anything wrong, that this is out of love. But that feeling very easily evolves into a sense that you were a burden, seeing someone else give up so much for you, especially in such a negative social and emotional environment, continually tearing down your self-esteem, that you, and only you, are responsible for tearing apart your family. All of this tells us that he is struggling with these thoughts, these feelings, all stemming from him being told that he is an outcast. And if you've ever felt that way, then you'll know how long it takes to unpack those feelings.
I'm angry at myself!
It's easy to think of Zuko as older, more mature than he really was, but he was only 11 when Ursa left, still a child, barely in the middle of his development psychologically and entering some of his most important years. I don't know what you were like at those ages, but I was still growing. I went through a pretty rough relationship in late high school. A lot happened. A lot that I, at that age, just didn't have the emotional tools to deal with. I wasn't equipped to support that person in the way that they needed, and it left me with a lot of emotional baggage to work through over the years. Guilt and shame and frustration with my inability to help them and manage what happened with her stayed with me for a long time. It changed me quite fundamentally, to be honest, almost single-handedly sparking my interest in mental health and prompting me to do something about it. And I was 18, 19 at that point when I was dealing with that, not 11 or 13, and I didn't have to do it alone. Zuko dealt with this guilt, this shame and abuse at a far more vulnerable age, and the scars it left him with, literally and psychologically, likely resulted in a form of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This first requires a stress factor, exposure to threatened death or serious injury, either directly or witnessing it. It's easy to focus on the Agni Kai as that instance. It is, after all, the moment that Zuko keeps returning to.
Normal teenagers worry about bad skin. I don't have that luxury. My father decided to teach me a permanent lesson on my face.
But as we've discussed, this moment grew out of a long history of shame and guilt, and even violence given the chance that he witnessed Ozai abusing Ursa. It's because of this that I actually believe Zuko suffers from complex post-traumatic stress disorder instead. Psychologically similar symptomatically, but defined by a chain of repeated traumatic events rather than a single incident. This is putting aside the fact that Zuko is repeatedly exposed to death and risk across his travels in the series. 2 negative alterations in cognition and mood. Inability to recall key features of the trauma, overly negative thoughts about oneself or the world, exaggerated blame of self or others for causing the trauma, negative affect, decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated, or difficulty being happy. Zuko definitely suffers from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. He is consistently plagued with feelings of failure and disappointment in himself, leading to overly negative thoughts about who he is and an exaggerated blame of himself for causing his own trauma. I deserved to be banished for my weakness. But the more interesting psychological effect here is difficulty being happy. Happiness doesn't come to Zuko naturally, and multiple times, rather than allowing himself to be happy, he shuts down the moment. We see this when he goes on a date with Jin in Ba Sing Se, turning away at the last second without explanation. The simple emotion to him feels wrong, undeserved, unnatural, and the moment he allows himself to feel happy in Season 2, when he and Iroh are running a tea shop together, it's fleeting, it's fragile, it falls apart the moment Azula walks back onto the scene, and that anger, that moodiness, the glares return. It is not only difficult to let himself be happy, but that feeling is easily undermined and destroyed. When he was first banished, Iroh presses him to enjoy the sights of the world. After all, he's gonna be out here for a while.
The only view I'm interested in seeing is the Avatar in chains.
There are a lot of reasons that people emerging from abusive dynamics find it difficult to be happy. Their emotions were often sidelined, their happiness minimized in favor of their siblings or spouses or their abuser. Their experiences were treated as less valuable, less real. I know some people who would express themselves and are told, okay, you feel that way, but you shouldn't. Here's all the reasons you shouldn't. It's not legitimate. It's recognizing that they feel that way, but not actually empathizing with it. People in these scenarios attempt to navigate these abusive emotional landscapes by either not expressing their emotions or reflexively suppressing them, and in the long term will struggle to express them openly, even in safe environments, often resulting in communication issues with partners or family because their problems, as well as their happiness, were never treated as equal. Zuko's difficulties being happy are also compounded by his fear of being seen as weak. So used to conditioning himself for a world of ruthlessness and power where empathy and connection, where we find so much of that happiness, is looked down on. The 3rd element of CPTSD is intrusion symptoms. Unwanted memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress at reminders, or physical reactivity after exposure to traumatic triggers.
Prince Zuko, have you forgotten what happened last time you dueled the Master?
I will never forget.
As Zhao comes to burn his face in the same way his father did, you can see the memory light up in his eyes in a flashback that momentarily shuts Zuko down. It paralyzes him. He repeatedly suffers from nightmares, like the ones we've discussed about Ursa, and emotional distress from things that bring back those darkest moments. In the comics, when he returns to the palace, Zuko suffers from chronic insomnia that turns into a kind of paranoia that he is not safe, that he cannot trust other people. These are intrusive thoughts. Zuko reflects on the past a lot across the series, most famously in Zuko Alone, but not all of these count as unwanted intrusive symptoms. Victims of abuse are often taught to remember their mistakes, to reinforce that shame that they are meant to feel, and Zuko is constantly in the process of re-evaluating his past. It's no surprise that we see so much of it. Even so, he does clearly exhibit intrusive symptoms of a kind. The 4th element of CPTSD is avoidance, avoiding trauma-related stimuli. This one is complicated, because until Season 3, Zuko doesn't really recognize that what his father did to him is wrong, and doesn't try to avoid things related to it. In the beach though, after finding himself amongst a swamp of old family memories in their old batch on Ember Island, Zuko's experience with this place suddenly becomes unpleasant. He's slowly realizing that his childhood, even with these scraps of happy memories, was a deeply traumatic period of his life, and he decides to destroy it.
I'm freezing.
I'll make a fire. There's plenty of stuff to burn in there.
One of my favorite moments in the entire series is when Azula comes to find Zuko at their family house.
I thought I'd find you here.
Those summers we spent here seem so long ago. So much has changed.
Come down to the beach with me. Come on, this place is depressing.
It's one of the only sincere moments of care and affection that Azula has with Zuko as an adult. She comes to find him when she didn't need to and asks him to come with her so he wouldn't be alone, because on some level she understands the pain he's in. When Zuko says so much has changed, it's not the memories or Ozai, but him and his perception of the past. For a long time, he tried to maintain that rosy view of his childhood, the one that he feared being an outcast from. But that's slowly been deconstructed, and by this point, he can't sustain it anymore. It's too caught up in what he is now realizing are traumatic events of his life. Azula and Zuko can look at each other honestly here and recognize that they have a shared trauma. All of this gives rise to a kind of avoidance, wanting to leave behind the things that remind him of that neglect, his shame, the guilt. The fifth element is alterations in arousal and reactivity. Irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, heightened startle reaction, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping. Many of these are self-evident in Zuko across the story, but I want to narrow in on risky and self-destructive behavior. In Bitter Work, Iroh teaches Zuko to redirect lightning, but after Iroh refuses to shoot lightning at him to test this technique, insisting it's dangerous, Zuko heads up to a mountaintop during a vicious storm, swearing at the sky in what is one of the most striking scenes of the series.
You've always thrown everything you could at me. Well, I can take it, and now I can give it back! Come on! Strike me! You've never held back before!
Some people have read this scene as Zuko being suicidal, but I want to push back against that. Zuko is seeking out a dangerous situation, yes, but not in an attempt to end his life so much as control the situation where he could not before. Many self-destructive behaviors can be understood as symbolic or literal reenactments of the initial abuse. They serve the function of regulating intolerable feeling states in the absence of more adaptive, self-soothing strategies. People harm themselves or engage in self-destructive behavior for a myriad of reasons, and not all of them have that suicidal subtext. Here, Zuko wants to be struck by lightning, an ability that he knows his sister has, but he doesn't. And it's also the purest form of firebending that his father used to scar him as a child. If we read this symbolically, as Herman suggests, this is Zuko not only wanting to demonstrate that he is finally Azula's equal, which was always a source of shame for him, but that he can handle himself where he was helpless before against his father. Something that actually plays out very literally when he confronts his father during the eclipse. No, this is instead Zuko trying to reconstruct his capacities for self-care and self-worth, first by asserting control and regulating that intolerable feeling state of helplessness, one he's been stuck with in a way his entire life, even if it's being done in a really unhealthy way. The last marker of CPTSD is functional significance. It must impact the person's ability to function in everyday life. One study looked at 9 areas of life and found that those suffering from PTSD exhibited problems with every single area except communication. Zuko's trauma repeatedly interferes with his ability to learn and apply the wisdom that Iroh imparts, and it clearly impedes his ability to take care of himself, often resulting in reckless, self-destructive behavior. He throws himself into the wilderness without food or water multiple times, prompted by those feelings rooted in trauma, and he cares little for his own daily needs of rest and respite, even neglecting food. The clearest way that we see his trauma interfere with his daily functioning, though, is probably with Iroh.
You brought this on yourself, you know. We could have returned together. You could have been a hero. You're a crazy old man! You're crazy! And if you weren't in jail, you'd be sleeping in a gutter!
His trauma, manifesting in anger and shame, significantly impacts his capacity to build healthy relationships, sabotaging them over and over as he turns on the one man trying to help him. It's important to note the longevity of these symptoms, though. Relapse is one of the most common experiences with people dealing with trauma, and it represents one of the major ways that it interferes with their life, returning over and over to those cyclical abusive dynamics and harming their healthy relationships. In Smoke and Shadow, Zuko enters a new social world as Fire Lord. He has responsibilities, new relationships, but that self-doubt creeps back in, and he finds it hard to engage in this new community, in this civic life. He falls back into old habits and defers to his father as a source of wisdom and truth. Returning to one's abusers, or no longer being convinced of the things that they have learned after they left them, is extremely common. So Zuko falls back into some crueler, anger-prone ways, and those feelings of isolation, shame, and weakness keep coming back. Because the road to healing is not a straight one. Sometimes it's slow. Sometimes it feels like you're sliding backwards, no matter how hard you work, and sometimes you take a wrong turn, even if you know where you want to end up. Despite all of this, I think it's most accurate to view Zuko's story as one of processing his neglect and abuse, one of rising beyond his past, losing his way and finding it again, of becoming.
I was never angry with you. I was sad because I was afraid you lost your way.
One way to look at processing trauma is changing how we evaluate ourselves, our decisions, our past, what happened to us, what in us is worth loving, and what in us is worth protecting. Children look to their parents for evaluative feedback, and this defines the framework through which children evaluate their own successes and failures. Children who are repeatedly exposed to negative and degrading interactions with their parents are likely to experience feelings of low self-worth and to evaluate their own performance through a harsh, negative lens, similar to that of their parents. Children who have suffered physical abuse are likely to attribute great importance to minor failures and blame themselves for these failures. Zuko's repeated negative and degrading interactions with his father mean his ability to evaluate himself is just a mess. And so much of recovery is unlearning and adjusting to a healthier way of evaluating yourself and the world. Those moments in which you begin to understand that the things they did were not okay, that you weren't a bad kid, that you did not deserve it, that you deserve support and love and care and time. Studies have identified two incredibly important factors in post-abuse recovery. The first is support from a safe parent, someone with whom they have the emotional infrastructure but not the abusive context that helps them shift that self-evaluation and self-concept. Ursa could have played this role if she was around. She stood up for him in the past, and it's likely that Zuko's ability to evaluate himself was a lot better when she was around. But once she vanished, his self-evaluation came mostly from Ozai. It's no surprise that there is such a marked difference between Zuko at 11 and 13 years of age. That's nearly a fifth of his life, some of his most formative years left with only his abuser as a parental guide. The things his mum taught him slowly melting away, replaced with everything that Ozai believes about him, that damaging self-concept. The second is physical distance from the abusive context, the person or the place. It's because of these that Zuko's recovery only really becomes psychologically possible after Iroh enters the picture, a safe parent, and ironically, after his banishment, distance. Following the death of Lu Ten, Zuko becomes Iroh's surrogate son of sorts, as much as Iroh became his surrogate father.
I'm sorry. I just nag you because, Well, ever since I lost my son,
Uncle, you don't have to say it.
I think of you as my own.
But there's something else here. There's a reluctance on Zuko's part to allow himself to feel that dynamic, to supplant Ozai in any way, because that would, on a subconscious level, mean acknowledging that Ozai was not a good father. But still, Iroh does push Zuko to deeply reevaluate his relationship with his past, his father, and the trauma he went through. And in those early stages, Zuko often responds by lashing out.
I think you are exactly what you seem. A lazy, mistrustful, shallow old man who's always been jealous of his brother.
One of the reasons that it's so difficult to help those in abusive relationships, whether they are children or adults, is that they can sometimes view help as someone trying to tear their relationship apart, malicious or jealous even. The victim might feel that they know their relationship better than you do. They know their family. You don't know what's going on. And often they'll acknowledge that, yeah, it's not perfect, but they're always convinced that it's going to get better, that they have some control over what happens and where it's going. Getting help, let alone leaving, means recognizing that they don't have that control, that it isn't real love, or that the good parts of the relationship aren't worth sticking around for. And that's a really hard thing to internalize, especially if you've been in that dynamic for years, if you've got kids with them, if you have invested that much of your life in this person. And that idea that the people who are trying to help are really trying to control you or don't understand is often reinforced by the abuser, which we actually see Azula do on Ozai's behalf multiple times.
Why don't you let him decide, Uncle?
It's the sense of, are you going to let others tell us how we should run our relationship or our family? Survivors will often have defended themselves as, I chose this life, but that's not always true. For a lot of people, it takes a long time to recognize what is going on, and Zuko certainly wasn't ready to confront that at times. He lashes out in similar ways, falling back on calling Iroh bitter and suspicious and jealous, seeing it as him trying to take his family away from him rather than trying to support him. And that unfortunately isolates them even further. But of course, in time, Iroh does break that wall down and manage to help Zuko, and we need to look at exactly how that happens psychologically. There are 5 critical elements underpinning how people recover and reevaluate themselves post-abuse: safe attachment, self-esteem and self-cohesion, meaning-making, symptom mastery, and affect tolerance. Safe attachment means developing healthy relationships broadly. Recovery can take place only within the context of relationships. It cannot occur in self-imposed isolation. In renewed connections with other people, the survivor recreates the psychological faculties that were damaged or deformed by the traumatic experience. These include the basic capacities for trust, autonomy, initiative, competence, identity, and intimacy. The guiding principle of recovery is to restore power and control to the survivor. Working to undo that feeling of Zuko as an outcast, his journey is full of him slowly rebuilding those relational capacities, creating a new support network of sorts. Zuko is met with empathy from an Earth Kingdom girl who sees his scars.
I know what you've been through. We've all been through it. The Fire Nation has hurt you. It's okay. They've hurt me too.
This takes him by surprise and challenges his belief in him being alone in the world, that he has to deal with this in self-imposed isolation, and it puts him in an unfamiliar relationship of trust and assurance. That bonding over shared strength, as he has to do with Ozai and Azula, isn't the only way, but over shared vulnerabilities too. There's a symmetry of experience between him and others, he begins to realize, and a similar moment happens in the Crossroads of Destiny when he reaches out to Katara and Katara empathizes with him over the Fire Nation taking their mothers away from them. Zuko alone is all about life amongst a poor Earth Kingdom family who house and feed and trust him, where he takes on a surrogate older brother role, mentoring this kid, giving him a glimpse of growing up in a healthier family. And he finds this difficult as he's rebuilding these relational capacities of trust and autonomy. He hands off a knife that Iroh gave him, exhibiting that same supportive role that Iroh did for him. Zuko and Jet work together to bring food to the masses, and he forms positive bonds with others in Ba Sing Se. He finds himself in a world where he is not an outcast. In each of these, Zuko forms healthy, safe connections with others on his own, developing that new capacity for trust and attachment and autonomy, ones based on connection and not performance or expectation, that false self. For much of the series, Zuko exists in a kind of self-imposed isolation. He lives around people, but refuses help. He will not talk about his issues. And in an emotional sense, he does not live in the same world as other people. This feeling most clearly intensifies when Zuko chooses to leave Iroh behind, insisting they have nothing more to learn from each other. It's only after seeing that his isolation is not as concrete or needed as he thinks it is, that he can exist in the same emotional world as others, that he allows himself to be vulnerable in a way that he hasn't been since Ursa was around, expanding his support network again and feeling more emotionally safe around others. That true self that was repressed after Ursa left is starting to come out again. But the most important relationship in all of this is, of course, with Iroh. Not only because he symbolically finds a new father, but because Iroh demonstrates what love and trust is, inviting him to trust in return. He creates that safe space, skills that he is then able to put into practice on his own when he finds himself in isolation without him. After Zuko speaks down to his crew and insists that their lives don't matter at all compared to his honor, Iroh does something very simple. He accepts the apology. He empathizes with Zuko's frustration. Forgiveness was not something Zuko ever lived with under Ozai, most famously during his Agni Kai, when he begged for it after unknowingly disrespecting his father. And after Zuko fails to capture Aang, Iroh encourages him to rest, rather than admonishing him as a failure. Iroh models a new kind of love, one with forgiveness and empathy, a recurring theme that culminates in perhaps the most powerful moment in the series.
I am so sorry, Uncle. I am so sorry and ashamed of what I did. I don't know how I can ever make it up to you, but How can you forgive me so easily? I thought you would be furious with me.
I was never angry with you. I was sad because I was afraid you lost your way.
Zuko's capacity to relate to others, to evaluate himself, was so damaged that he didn't understand how Iroh could ever forgive him. Even this far along the path to reconstructing his ability to create safe attachments with people, he still expects anger. And it is only Iroh's unending, ceaseless, forgiving love that brings him through it. Self-esteem and self-cohesion is intended to ensure that the self-injurious behaviors and impulses are replaced by healthy, self-caring routines. Feelings of guilt, shame, and self-blame are relinquished in favor of a new or newly restored sense of self-worth. Obsessive, self-critical review is replaced by a more realistic appraisal, reflecting a more positive view of the self as one deserving of care and capable of leading a self-caring, self-fulfilling existence. At the beginning, Zuko exhibits an inability to let himself rest. Self-care is treated as weakness, as laziness, and there is no time for healing. Guilt, shame, and self-blame are pervasive forces in Zuko's mind that control an extremely negative self-concept. But in the same way that Iroh exhibits understanding and forgiveness, he also reinforces Zuko's sense of self-worth. He validates Zuko's efforts and firebending skills, which have always been a source of insecurity and shame for him.
Excellent form, Prince Zuko.
You taught me well.
And when Zuko finds he cannot shoot lightning like Azula, Iroh doesn't just treat him like a failure, but he takes into account Zuko's struggles and teaches him an alternate skill that more fits his abilities: lightning redirection. He gives him a realistic appraisal with a route to finding new strengths and meaning. He validates Zuko for doing the right thing over and over, most famously after Zuko lets Appa go from under Lake Laogai, building up his self-esteem and self-concept.
You did the right thing. letting the Avatar's bison go free.
Eventually, Zuko allows himself to explore this new way of looking at himself, and he finds that he is happier and more fulfilled, starting a tea shop with Iroh. He even recognizes that he does deserve rest and care. He finds love in tea. Satisfaction in living a simple life of love, connection, and humility, which Iroh always told him was the one true antidote to shame. That damaging self-concept as the banished, weak prince and Ozai's obedient son, the source of his shame, is slowly undone. This shift in how he understands honor eventually leads him to find the luxuries of royal life in the capital hollow, the palanquin, the food, the wealth, because he has come to understand on some level that his honor is not a material thing. His anger is deeply wound up in his firebending, and Iroh encourages him to find a new source to control himself in those impulses. Firebending comes from the breath, not the muscles. This bears fruit when he faces the dragons and works to understand that firebending can come from his love, his warmth, his passion, not just his anger. Those old, self-destructive, risk-taking tendencies are undone, and Zuko finds new, healthier ways of processing his emotions. Fundamentally, Iroh's most important role is offering a new kind of self-concept, a new way to evaluate himself, a new route to fulfillment that Zuko never would have otherwise found, nurturing a new sense of who he needs and wants to be.
I'm begging you, Prince Zuko. It's time for you to look inward and begin asking yourself the big questions. Who are you? And what do you want?
Meaning making is when the survivor assigns new meaning to the trauma, to the self, and to the world in which traumatic events occur and recur. Some individuals, as they discard a sense of the damaged self, will embrace the belief that misfortune endured has yielded newfound strength and compassion, and others will transform their experience into creative pursuit or determined social action, embracing a survivor mission, imbuing their experiences with meaning that is both life-affirming and self-affirming. This is all deeply tied to reconstructing one's self-esteem and self-cohesion. Meaning-making is about re-evaluating the traumatic events in a healthier way. Victims will often start out believing that they deserved it, that they tempted their abuser, or even if they recognize they didn't, they'll still be unwilling to blame the abuser, which we very much see with Zuko. Over time, though, Zuko begins to internalize that maybe he didn't. That conversation with the Earth Kingdom girl recognized that it wasn't okay. Same with Katara in the Crossroads of Destiny. When Zuko insists that he wants his destiny, Iroh pressures him over and over to ask what that really means.
Is it your own destiny? Or is it a destiny someone else has tried to force on you?
This question isn't just asking Zuko to reconsider where he wants to be in life, but it's forcing him to reckon with how the destiny he has been chasing is deeply rooted in him believing that he deserved to be neglected, abused, and banished. Iroh is pressing Zuko to understand something he has been afraid to believe, that it was child abuse, that there was no justification, that this was all forced upon him and it was not his choice. The moral stance of the therapist is therefore of enormous importance. It is not enough for the therapist to be neutral or non-judgmental. The patient challenges the therapist to share her own struggles with these immense philosophical questions. The therapist's role is not to provide ready-made answers, but rather to affirm a position of moral solidarity with the survivor. Iroh, in this sense, takes on the role of counselor in meaning-making, standing in moral solidarity with Zuko, but not providing the answer. In a way, he models a kind of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, helping to construct that new trauma narrative, correcting those negative and distorted thoughts around his trauma, and linking them in with his behaviors in ways that he wasn't considering on his own. Challenging that destiny is about helping him find a new autonomy as well, a life he has chosen for himself after being told for his life that his wants and needs just aren't as legitimate. Following this moment, when trapped with Katara, Zuko does, for the first time, blame the Fire Nation rather than himself for the loss of his mother. Even if he doesn't blame Ozai specifically, his trauma narrative here is beginning to change, and he feels lost. Psychologically, this is a very common reaction for people just beginning the road to recovery, a loss of direction or purpose or cohesion at first. Regardless of them starting to heal, it can still feel like your understanding of yourself or your past and the world is falling away, something that people rely on even if it's an unhealthy view of it. That's why meaning making is so hard to do, and it needs to be done in a supportive, safe environment. Because for a lot of people, the traumatic events in their past are intimately tied to the good parts of their life too. The line between them can be so thin, especially for a child, that letting go of one can mean destroying the other, and that is so hard. Even so, after getting this close, it's such a vulnerable position to find yourself in that Zuko relapses and returns to his father, something that feels more stable and reliable, unable to resist that fulfillment he thinks he wants. But it does lead to an interesting moment psychologically in his meaning-making journey.
My father decided to teach me a permanent lesson on my face!
Here, Zuko seems to recognize on some level that what his father did was wrong, but not the broader context of his abuse. This again is very common, recognizing that an instance of abuse is wrong, but that it was the exception and the broader social context is fine. This is the calm in that cycle of abuse. They've reconciled, and Ozai assures him that everything is fine, and survivors will latch onto that, when of course it will not last forever. Zuko here insists that he is angrier than ever, and he doesn't know why, blaming himself again. He still can't quite yet believe and reach that new trauma narrative. He hasn't emerged as his true self, feeling worthy of protection and love, and he's still stuck behind his false self. As he says, he was the son his father always wanted, but it wasn't him. It is only later, in facing his father during the eclipse, that Zuko fully internalizes a new trauma narrative.
My father, who challenged me, a 13-year-old boy, to an Agni Kai. How can you possibly justify a duel with a child?
It was to teach you respect.
It was cruel, and it was wrong.
That 1, what his father did to him was cruel and wrong. 2, he wasn't weak. He was just trying to please his father. And 3, that he is in a better place now. He can handle his emotions and he knows what he needs to do. Recognizing, repudiating, and having a plan moving forward are key parts of a recovery trauma narrative. He's confronted the existential despair that he could not face as a child, that his father is a terrible parent. He's mourned the loss of that trust, and he is moving on. And like a lot of survivors, Zuko creates meaning from those traumatic experiences. He has held on to what he has learned, that it has made him wiser and compassionate and knowledgeable as he ventured across the world. And to be clear, that is not to say that there is always a purpose to someone's suffering, or that going through terrible things is important because it makes you stronger. That's wrong, and it's harmful, and it's dismissive a lot of the time. Sometimes, traumatic experiences are just traumatic. This simply respects that traumatic experiences are multi-dimensional. Secondly, his trauma becomes a social action mission. He insists that he is going to help the Avatar defeat the Fire Lord, and he knows his place in that. Between all this, Zuko has found new meaning in his past, in himself, and with it, is forging a new future. Symptom mastery is when persistent symptoms have abated or become more manageable. Stimuli that act as triggers can be avoided with healthy coping routines and stress management techniques that are resistant to extinction. Zuko manages this as well. When he starts to feel himself isolating, he instead reaches out to those he trusts, avoiding shutting down. Lastly, affect tolerance. This ensures that the effects associated with traumatic events no longer overwhelm or threaten to overwhelm and are deprived of their immediacy and fierce intensity, defensive numbing, and without dissociation and dangerous impulse. Exposure to fire or threats of physical violence do not cause Zuko to numb or the like, But not all traumas require all of these things to be reconstructed. Sometimes trauma survivors are able to mobilize strengths in one of these domains to cope with vulnerabilities and secure recovery in another. This is kind of what we see here. Zuko doesn't flinch when he's facing down against his father during the eclipse because he's always had that affect tolerance, and he uses that to make meaning for himself, speaking his trauma narrative to his abuser. Slowly but surely, Zuko builds new relationships, finds a new understanding himself, makes meaning from his trauma, and is no longer affected by it.
Growing up, we were taught that the Fire Nation was the greatest civilization in history. And what an amazing lie that was.
There is an understated and under-discussed side to Zuko's psychological growth. We've focused a lot on how trauma works, what it does to us, how we recover from it. But baked into his past, almost foundationally, is the nationalistic ideology that Zuko is exposed to about the Fire Nation and the war. Questioning his loyalties is deeply tied to him seeing what the war really means, what it's doing to people, and what his father is doing to people. What does being Crown Prince mean in a world like this? Iroh writes back to Zuko during the siege of Ba Sing Se when he was a child, describing the city as magnificent and awe-inspiring. He notes the superior craftsmanship of their knives and jokes about burning the city to the ground. I find this moment really interesting, because it shows Iroh before he too recognizes the horrors of war, instead painting it with a subtext of honor and glory, a gentleman's war. It is only after losing Lu Ten, his son, in this very siege, that Iroh sees the true nature of war and renounces it, if only privately.
Leaves from the vine, falling so slow.
World War II saw over 70 million dead, 11,600 people every day, one every 7 seconds, for years. With the deadliest bout of that being in the Pacific Theater against Imperial Japan, by far the main inspiration for the Fire Nation. Part of the reason the death count was so high was the distance, physical and emotional, between the higher-ups and the experiences of the average soldier. The military, including those at the top, were intensely radicalized with a utopian vision of spreading Japanese supremacy and prosperity across Asia, believing that what they lacked in materials, they would make up with courage and a willingness to sacrifice, something they felt their enemies in China and the United States lacked. They bought their own propaganda, in other words, because all of this is really easy to believe when you don't see people dying. You instead just hear the tales coming back of the glory, the spectacle of war. It is hard to escape the nationalistic ocean in which you swim, and it bleeds into your understanding of history. Fire Nation children were taught that the air nomads had a military, that it was not a genocide, it was a fair fight. And Zuko was likely taught the same. In Nazi Germany, they made sure to depict the Jews as a nefarious, rich, powerful group undermining the German people and society, rather than the reality. A diaspora of disconnected small communities. I do not underestimate the greatest enemy with whom we have to fight, but I reject Jewry with every means in my power, and without reserve, in order to preserve the hereditary endowment of my people. Depicting them as an adversarial group, a cohesive collective, rather than individuals, as Fisher does here, muddies the waters in the minds of people, justifying their deportation and genocide. It's just the enemy. When Auschwitz workers were asked how they could possibly participate in these atrocities against civilians, they answered that, to them, enemies were everywhere. They were told they came from every walk of life. They were academics and they were businessmen, not just soldiers. They were trying to destroy their people in every way, culturally and socially. And so the line between civilian and soldier simply disappeared. They were all enemies of the state. That's the sort of belief that Zuko was brought up with, an honourable war as a way of spreading prosperity, and that there never was a genocide, but a war against those in the way of progress. This is, again, a kind of child abuse, lying to them about the world and dictating to them their role in it, their place. What does it mean to deconstruct those beliefs? Beliefs that are deeply tied to your understanding of how the world is meant to work and your understanding of yourself. The psychology of radicalization and de-radicalization helps articulate how this happens, focusing on the significance quest. People want to feel like what they do matters, that they have a place in the world, that they are not an outcast, but are building towards something that matters. This is often exported on a nationalistic and political level to the entire population. Radical nationalistic and political ideologies will exploit this feeling by giving people that sense of significance, often exporting it to the entire population in a cultural narrative, even if that significance entails committing or endorsing violence. When Zuko protested at the war meeting to his father, he took issue with sacrificing Fire Nation soldiers needlessly, not with the war broadly, seeing the violence as necessary to spread their prosperity and progress to the entire world. For a long time, Zuko finds personal significance in his role as the Crown Prince, as a part of that, participating in this global, generational project to bring the world under the Fire Nation's righteous rule. Honor is a material thing. A clear comparison can be drawn to the Imperial Japanese population, a national quest over decades in which they all have significance. And to truly understand how deep this can go, I want to read you some of the last words of 23-year-old Ichizo Hayashi, who famously wrote to his mother before sacrificing his life in a suicidal attack. I am pleased to have the honor of having been chosen as a member of a special attack force that is on its way to battle, but I cannot help crying when I think of you, Mum. When I reflect on the hopes you had for my future, I feel so sad that I am going to die without doing anything to bring you joy. These were complicated people with dreams and hopes, but they were all warped to work within that nationalistic ideology. In particular though, loss of significance due to personal failure invites a collectivist shift towards one's group and its norms and values, and they tended more strongly to self-identify as members of collectors, nation or religion, rather than as individuals. Peoples whose lives do not appear to be going well are disposed to embrace an ideology, whether it be nationalistic, social, or religious, that promises significance if only one followed its dictates. Again, this theme of failure and shame keeps coming back. With Ozai's reinforcement that Zuko is a failure, it is no surprise that Zuko falls more deeply into identifying with his role within this nationalistic collective, attaching it to him being the Crown Prince, trying to follow its dictates to feel like he's worth something. The first time that Ozai tells him he is proud of him is when he thinks Zuko has killed the Avatar, the Fire Nation's ultimate threat, believing that Zuko has finally given up on himself as an individual and fallen into the collective under him. It's because of all of this that it should be no surprise that Zuko reaches his most nationalistic right after being banished. His lowest point, where those feelings of losing significance, of failure, of shame, of being an outcast, are most intense. One study even found that cultures which place a value on honor and obedience are more prone to radical nationalistic ideologies because they can more easily exploit people's fear of losing significance. De-radicalization then centers on finding a new significance, and that's exactly what Zuko does. De-radicalization may occur if one came to regard one's radical means as morally unacceptable, ineffective, or both, and hence unlikely to promote one's significance. De-radicalization may reflect a weakening of such radicalizing influence by falling outside of its sphere. It is only in being physically removed from the Fire Nation, even on the run from it, that Zuko falls outside of the social spheres reinforcing his radicalization and into a new social sphere, developing new connections, new values, friendships, trust on his own. But more importantly, he is confronted firsthand with the realities of the war that he and his family have waged. He sees the scars inflicted on civilians, the families torn apart by the dead. He sees towns wiped off the map, refugees fleeing. And for what? Slowly, that perception of the war as a noble, honorable conflict is broken down, much the same way as happened with Iroh. The war is not only an ineffective way of bringing prosperity to the world, but horribly wrong. Iroh focuses on Zuko as an individual rather than as part of a collective. He gives him a new way of reintegrating into society, a new individualism. Where Zuko fell into radicalization because of those feelings of failure, Iroh builds him up till he has a sense of honor that exists outside of that ideological framework. And one of the most interesting parts of this shift is his psychological relationship to being the Crown Prince. At the start, Zuko's identity is expectedly very caught up in that role in the nationalistic collective, but Zuko's loyalty to the Fire Nation begins to fade. When he cuts off his top knot to disguise himself, it's also symbolically severing ties with the Fire Nation some way, inescapably. He begins to explore who he is then outside that royal context, what significance he can find, until, that is, Zuko alone. For a long time, his self-concept and significance has been dominated by Ozai's belief about who he should be. But he's starting to recognize that either he's never going to get that, or that he doesn't want it, to the point of even letting go of his identity as Crown Prince. You might think that Iroh would even encourage this. After all, he's helping him find a new self-concept, but he actually does the opposite. In The Avatar and the Fire Lord, Iroh gives Zuko the Crown Prince's headdress, insisting it is for him, that he shouldn't purge that part of himself, but that it doesn't mean he has to support the war and its cruelty that it symbolizes. In Zuko alone, Zuko reflects on who his mother made him too, that he is someone who fights for what is right, that he might get knocked down, but he keeps on getting up again. There's a new meaning to being the Crown Prince in all of this, and he starts to internalize that he will pick it back up when it means all of those things.
My name is Zuko, son of Ursa and Fire Lord Ozai, Prince of the Fire Nation and heir to the throne.
I think it's really interesting here that before he mentions Fire Lord Ozai, before he mentions being heir to the throne, the things that give him status and power, he declares he is Ursa's son. He's wrestling with both these conceptions of himself, these two different routes to significance. So it's no surprise how demoralizing it is when he reveals himself and is cast out from the village. Even when he tries to help, when he tries a new way, he isn't wanted. Despite seeing this, he still can't quite let go of that significance that he finds within Ozai's nationalistic ideology. It's so deeply entrenched in his mind as Crown Prince, obedient son, because his family emotions are so caught up in it as well. The line between family and nation has blurred. And it's because of this as well that he relapses, because it's so easy to fall back into it, to return to his father. But this itself leads to a crucial step in de-radicalization. Even after attaining everything he thought he wanted, achieving those goals, even after investing everything in this way of looking at the world, he is still unhappy. He has not found that significance that he thought he would, and it leads to his final disillusionment, culminating in Zuko's showdown with his father during the eclipse.
Growing up, we were taught that the Fire Nation was the greatest civilization in history, and somehow, the war was our way of sharing our greatness with the rest of the world. What an amazing lie that was. The people of the world are terrified by the Fire Nation. They don't see our greatness. They hate us, and we deserve it.
See, much like Iroh offers a new self-concept, Iroh and Ursa help Zuko find a new route to personal significance, one where he feels empowered, happy, where he can be himself, where he has overcome his past, someone who can end the war and find honor for himself.
But you have always followed your own path. You restored your own honor.
It's easy to feel stuck in your trauma, in the cycles of abuse and relapse and the struggle to find out who the hell you're meant to be in the wake of it. For some people, it's such a big part of their life that They're left not feeling like a real person, just this thing left over that had things happen to them. But where Azula serves to remind us that some people are still lost in the mires of abuse, Zuko gives us hope that one day they will find peace. Maybe you just need a hand out of it. If you've ever been in an abusive family, or relationship, or friendship, if you've been consumed by your anger, your fear, your loneliness, then you'll know what it's like to lose a sense of yourself, of who you are, of being someone worthy of love. But Zuko's story reminds me of a line that I want to share from Albert Camus. In the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer. Things might be hard right now, but hold on to that invincible summer. Hold on, till you find that person that takes you in their arms and tells you that they were never angry. They were just afraid you had lost your way.
Hey everyone, if you don't know me, my name's Alex and I've been the editor behind most of this channel's videos for the last almost 3 years. And I'm here to sadly announce that this video is my last. I know, it's too much. Tim was kind enough to let me choose which video would be my final, and I think this Zuko psychology video kind of dealing with mental health while also talking about Avatar is just kind of the perfect culmination and send-off for my time doing work for this amazing community. So I wanted to say thank you to you all for supporting content like this. Like, if it weren't for you, this job wouldn't have been possible for me. It wouldn't be possible for Tim. None of us would be able to do this if it weren't for you. So thank you. Before I became a part of this amazing community, I was married, confused, and working a day job to support a life that I didn't really realize was wrong for me, and I was just trying too hard to make it work. But thanks to my friends, family, Tim, the Tale Foundry, and all of you, I feel like I'm finally on a path that'll lead to my own self-fulfillment one day. And yeah, if it weren't for all of you guys, I wouldn't be here right now. And that's something that I'll always keep close to my heart, and I'll always remember you all for. So thank you. Again, this is just gonna be me saying thank you a million times. But that's exactly the thing. All things in life serve as stepping stones, and I feel like it would be wrong of me to try and make this stepping stone last forever. As much as I want to keep making Avatar videos, mental health videos, and talking about writing and world building, eventually, 5 years down the line, however long, I'll end up hating it, and I just don't want that. I want to be able to remember this fondly. Last fall, I started going to animation school, and with the Tale Foundry, the other channel I work for, I think it's really time for me to buckle down for the next 3.5, 4 years and just focus on my animation and Tale Foundry, and just let those two things serve as my current stepping stones, where my feet are planted. I think it's the best next step for me, and I'm very excited to see what comes of all of it. So wish me luck if you care. I mean, if you didn't care, you probably would have clicked away by now. So thank you for watching me talk. See, she's sad that I'm leaving Tim. And you don't even know who he is. This channel and its community has always been important to me. And I'm actually kind of excited that I get to sit back again and enjoy it as a viewer. I get to see a new video pop up from Hello Future Me that I haven't watched 1,000,000 times over because I've been sitting in my bedroom for 30 hours editing it. I get to watch it as a viewer. I get to be surprised. So I'm very excited for that. If you want to keep up with my work, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram or my YouTube if you want to see some of my upcoming animation projects, or you can go over to Tale Foundry, where that's just where all my editing work will be done in the future, and we've got some really cool stuff planned over there. So I recommend you pop over there and check it out. It's gonna be beautiful. So that's about it. I mean, I feel bad for taking up this much time, but if you're still here, thank you for listening. I love you. If it weren't for all of you, again, I wouldn't be able to be here, and I appreciate you with all my heart. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future. God, I can't get that outro the way he does. How does he say? He goes, stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future. He says it so, like, dramatically, and I can't really pull off the dramatic. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future. I guess is that good? Is that as good as it's gonna get?